Thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm really excited to talk to you all about some of my Playful Learning Landscapes work and really talking about how these types of experiences and everyday spaces can support early learning and strengthen relationships through play. So I want to give you a bit of a roadmap for my talk today. First, I want to tell you what Playful Learning Landscapes is. And then I'll give you two examples of how we've taken this initiative and applied it to two types of projects. The first is a project where we worked with community members to put Playful Learning Landscapes, or PLL as I'll sometimes call them, in public spaces in California. And the second project that I'll talk about is an application of PLL in early childhood education. I'll close with some discussion and future considerations, and I'm going to try to leave some time at the end to answer any questions. But I will say, if you have questions while I'm going through the slides, please just raise your hand, shout out, just let me know. I'm happy to answer questions through as well. Okay, so let's start with what Playful Learning Landscapes is. And to get there, I really want to talk a little bit about the science, right? So the science of playful learning. What did we get from the science, and how does that inform our application and our translational efforts? Well, I want to point out that we know, based on a lot of research, that children learn best when learning environments are active, when they're engaging, meaningful, social, iterative, and joyful, right? So there's a lot of empirical evidence to support that these pillars really are how humans learn best, not just children, but adults as well. And we know that when we take these types of learning environments and we put a learning goal on top of it, that we can really foster very strong learning outcomes. And when we think about what's important for children to learn today in the 21st century, we've really coalesced around these 6 C skills. This includes communication, content, or sorry, I should start with collaboration. It's really our first C. So collaboration, communication, content. When I say content, I mean things like science or STEM learning, math learning, literacy, vocabulary, critical thinking skills, creative innovation or creativity, and confidence, right? Confidence to persist through failure or to try something again in a different way. So we know that these are really important skills to learn, and we know that we can learn these skills best through environments or learning experiences that reflect these pillars, right? And something that we have found or have hypothesized is that these can really shine through play, right? We know that when people are playing, and when children are playing, that they're very active, that they're very engaged. Oftentimes there's something meaningful attached to that play experience. There's a lot of social interaction that can be embedded in play, and play can be very joyful, right? And so can we harness what we know about play, and can we harness what we know about these pillars and put a learning goal on top of that? So that's really central to our model for playful learning. So what is playful learning? Well, playful learning is an umbrella term that encompasses a variety of different ways of playing. It includes free play, guided play, and games. And these are really distinguished from direct instruction. Now, direct instruction is what you're typically seeing in formal education. Honestly, it's what you're seeing right now. It's with me, telling you a lot of information, and you're sort of sitting back and listening and taking that information in. But there's not a lot of direct engagement, right? And so the way that these different types of play are distinguished from direct instruction is really in who directs that experience and who initiates that experience. And what we know is that in direct instruction, as I just mentioned, these are really adult initiated and adult directed, right? So again, what am I doing? I'm initiating this learning experience for you all, and I'm really directing it for you, right? So it's distinguished from, on the other end of the spectrum, free play. So in free play settings, we see a lot of child initiated exploration and discoveries, and it's very child directed. And when I say child directed, what I mean is that there's not necessarily sorry, I should say, when it's child directed, it's very exploratory. There's a lot of discovery, but there's not an adult involved typically, or there's not a learning goal involved, right? So children can really explore and discover at their own pace. With guided play and games, these sit in the middle between free play and direct instruction. And what we see here oftentimes in these types of learning experiences is something that can be adult initiated or adult set up, right? So you can imagine setting up some type of play-based experience but you have a learning goal in mind. But children really get to direct that experience. They can explore, and the adult can really serve in this sort of guiding or scaffolding role, right? So sort of gently nudging children to a learning goal that they already have in mind when they set up that situation. So really what we see here in terms of learning goals is a difference between free play not having an explicit learning goal at the outset, whereas these different types of learning environments have those explicit learning goals embedded. So really what we're trying to consider with playful learning landscapes is how we could embed these principles of how children learn best and what children need to learn to be successful in the 21st century into an experience that is adult initiated and child directed. So really what we're talking about are guided play and games, right? And when I say games, I mean things like, board games or hopscotch. So those are some of those more rule-based and structured games. And they're a little bit different from other types of guided play experiences that don't have that rule-based goal attached to it. So what do we know about guided play, right? So I've just told you that it's fairly likely that guided play can support strong learning outcomes. And we do actually have some evidence from the science to support that that's the case. So in empirical studies where children have been asked to learn in different types of environments, including direct instruction, free play, and guided play, several studies have shown that children's learning, when it's assessed after that experience, is actually best when they're in a guided play and learning environment, right? So again, when that adult is initiating that and children are directing it and there's an explicit learning goal, children have the strongest learning outcomes. So there's a variety of evidence here to suggest that guided play is really beneficial as a tool for learning. We also know that there are different educational approaches that emphasize guided play or discovery-based pedagogical practices. And so these are programs like Schools of the Mind or Montessori schools. And several studies have shown that those types of programs are really supportive of children's early learning and development as well. So we have quite a bit of evidence here to suggest that guided play is a really powerful way of transmitting information and of fostering these really strong or sticky learning goals, right? So one of the motivating questions behind playful learning landscapes that builds off of this evidence is whether or not we can create these types of guided playful learning experiences in everyday spaces where families spend time. Again, to really prompt those types of conversations and interactions that we know are strengthening learning. So one of the first playful learning landscapes projects in Philadelphia, the question was essentially asked, could we take a bus stop and could we transform it in a way that encourages this type of interaction between caregivers and children? And what was created was this really beautiful bus stop, right? So imagine this used to be just a simple bus shelter here, and it was reimagined so that there were different ways of interacting and playing in the space. So here we have a puzzle wall. There's this really beautiful figure. It's called Hidden Figures. And what happens is as the weather changes, it casts different shapes and shadows on the ground. Behind this, you can't quite see it, but there's something called a story walk that prompts families and children to tell stories. And so you can see here the idea of embedding something into a public space, right? So while you're waiting for the bus stop, typically you're not talking much, you're not doing much, especially if you're a family in that space, because it doesn't really afford that type of conversation or experience. But when you simply tweak that space, you can see a lot of opportunities for families and kiddos to start talking about different concepts like spatial language, like shape language, storytelling, and doing that with their caregiver while they're waiting, right? And there's evidence from this application of playful learning landscapes that when we put this in this particular bus stop, we actually observed more talk about STEM or science and math concepts, more talk about literacy concepts compared to a matched control site, right? So that was a really nice application of this. And it really inspired a lot of different empirical work of looking at how this could be applied to not just the bus stop, but other spaces like the library and the grocery store. And in each one of these early studies, what was found time and time again was that playful learning landscapes in community spaces is increasing the amount of conversation that is happening between caregivers and children. And it's really promoting higher quality interactions in these spaces, right? More back and forth conversations, less technology use, for instance. So in the past 5 years, we've taken these early findings and we've developed what's called the playful learning model. This is a three-part equation or a three-part model that we have argued can be integrated into any type of public space or educational space to really highlight these opportunities for families. And our model really starts and has evolved over time to begin with a question about who. Who are we going to be working with? And what are those communities' particular values and practices, right? So while the first set of playful learning landscapes in the bus stop and the library and the grocery store, they were sort of a proof of concept that we could create these types of experiences. But when we take a step back, we have to say, okay, what can we include into these experiences that is really meaningful to the specific community in which these will be installed and for the users of this, right? So when we start with the who, we co-design these types of activities with communities. And I'll show you some examples of how we do that in the two applications of PLL that I'll talk about today. And when we combine the who with the how and the what, right, the how children learn best and the what children need to learn to succeed in the 21st century, we're really creating this nice model for how to promote early learning in everyday spaces for people and with people that live in those communities. Okay, so I'm going to kind of transfer now. So I think we have a decent understanding of what Playful Learning Landscapes is and what our model is for creating these. So I want to talk about two studies where we applied this three-part model to the creation of Playful Learning Landscapes. And the first study that I'll talk about is creating Playful Learning Landscapes in public spaces in Santa Ana, California. And I want to point out the very large interdisciplinary team that worked on this project with me. This was a study that was funded by the National Science Foundation. It was a 5-year project, so it just wrapped up last year. So we're really excited to finally have all of these playful learning installations in this community, and a lot of our data has been collected, which is really exciting. The main, project, the main aim of this project is really to go into a community space in California and to reimagine a bus stop, a park, and a grocery store, right? So we had targeted these spaces in Philadelphia, and we wanted to see how our model would be best applied to the creation of these same or similar types of spaces in Santa Ana. And in order to make sure that we were really elevating the first part of our equation, the who, we developed a community partnership or a research practice partnership with a nonprofit organization called the Santa Ana Early Learning Initiative, or SALE. SALE is a nonprofit organization in the community that we were going to be putting these playful learning installations. It's a consortium of local families, teachers, and administrators from local school districts who are all joined by a shared mission to provide enriching opportunities for children ages 0 to 9 in their community. And this really aligned with the mission of Playful Learning Landscapes, right? So we really want to strengthen learning outcomes for kiddos, especially those from under-resourced communities. And so when we approached SALE and asked if this is a type of partnership they thought would be valuable, they were really very excited about the opportunity, and they wanted to work with us to realize something that could be put in their community spaces to highlight these playful learning opportunities. And so we were able to actually reach out to families who are part of SALE through a liaison, their executive director for SALE, and 40 caregivers, mostly mothers, decided to co-design playful learning installations with us. This project started in 2020, in the fall of 2020, so we hosted these workshops over Zoom. We had one workshop every month where we invited families to join us for about 2 hours in the evening, and we did a variety of activities with them. These activities were really meant to uncover their core practices and values, And we did this by asking them to complete a variety of cool arts and crafts activities, to tell us stories. We asked them what locations in your neighborhood would be really excellent places for us to embed playful learning installations. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what we did with families. So one of the things that we did is we actually mailed families what we called bags of stuff. And the bags of stuff included a bunch of art supplies, right? So cardstock, pens, crayons, stickers, pipe cleaners, just a variety of fun things that they could use to tell us what design ideas they had for these different community spaces. And so we gave them some simple prompts over Zoom, and we asked them to create something. And then we asked them to tell us what they created and to provide some background about what inspired that idea. And so these were a variety of parents showing us their designs. They're really beautiful. And I'm going to highlight a couple of them here. So in this top picture here, you can see that one parent, when we asked them kind of, what are some fun ways or unique ways that we could support early science and math learning in the community, a parent told us that she would really like to see an abacus because that's the way that she learned how to use math when she was, or how to learn math when she was a kid. And she thought it would be a really excellent way to teach her own kiddos simple math and counting, right? Another parent told us that they thought that a ruler would be a really fun way to encourage some talk about math. And they embedded on their ruler some shapes and some colors, right? We had a caregiver here who created this really awesome like giant wheel that you could spin. And she said, my kids would love it if there was something in the community that they could just spin, right? Like they love that kind of stuff. And so we thought, okay, we could probably build off of something like this, right? Ultimately, what a lot of parents told us is that they had a lot of experiences that they wanted to support their kiddos learning with that were intergenerational to them, right? Things that they meant something to them or something to the way that they learned how to understand, science or math when they were little. And so they really wanted to highlight that in their community. They wanted a lot of really, just beautiful designs, colorful designs. They wanted it to look very inviting. Another activity that we did with caregivers to identify some of their values was we asked them to complete this Mad Libs activity. And essentially, if you've ever played Mad Libs, you're just asked to fill in the blank, right? And so we would say, okay, fill in these blanks with descriptions and values and characteristics and feelings so that we could get a sense for what was really important to them. And they told us that they really wanted to see something in their community that was fun, right? They wanted something joyful. They wanted something that represented their culture. They wanted to see Spanish embedded in their community because they were all primarily Spanish speakers. And they really wanted to feel safe, secure, and protected in our community, right? So that was something that they felt was lacking, for instance, in some of their parks. They felt that those parks were safe spaces, and they thought that if we came in and sort of reclaimed those spaces through Playful Learning Landscapes, it might make them really inviting places to be. So I'm going to give you a quick example of how we took some of parents' ideas and made them into our eventual playful learning installations. So returning to our abacus idea, we thought this would be a really great idea for applying to a bus stop, right? And so we had a graphic design artist mock up what we could maybe, put into the bus stop. We said, let's make an abacus bus stop. Put something like that here. So that's what they drew for us. And we took this back to parents and we said, okay, you told us an abacus was really important. And we also all decided that a bus stop might be pretty nice to put one of these. So how does this sound? Would you use an abacus at the bus stop, right? If it was a large size and it was embedded into the shelter. So we got a lot of feedback throughout the first about 3 years of this project, where we were really getting their design ideas, going to a graphic artist and asking for some prototypes, bringing it back to families. And this iterative process continued until we had a final design that everybody was happy with. One thing that we did that was really important is we took these ideas that we were starting to coalesce around and we brought them to families in this kind of life-size format. So this is something I haven't shown you yet, but this was our How Tall Am I mural. So we had an idea for a mural, again, kind of embedding some of the things that we learned from families. So a ruler, we said, let's take a ruler instead of putting it on the ground, let's lift it up vertical, and then let's put something around it so that you can start to compare yourself to different animals, for instance, or talk about your height compared to your caregiver's height, right? And so we took these ideas through those images to families. And then later, when we decided on a set of about 4 or 5 designs that we were going to move forward with, we brought them to families in a community space and we asked them to interact with them and to provide feedback about that experience. And so here you can see this was our way of trying to low cost create an abacus bus stop installation mock-up, right? So this is an abacus. We had kiddos interacting with it with their caregivers, and then we asked caregivers to provide their feedback about the different designs on these whiteboards here, or these poster boards. This was really sort of the final step, one of the final steps in the process to make sure that after prototyping this with families, they were able to use this, that they liked these ideas, they liked these designs. And then at that point, we really were able to go to fabricators and ask them to create the blueprints for these designs that would eventually be placed in the community. So you can see here, this is the abacus bus stop. This is the final sort of blueprint for that, right? That somebody who knows how to do this, certainly it's not me, put this into a bus shelter, right? So they had all of the specific logistics for how to make that happen. And then we were able to put these in the community. So what I want to show you next are the final designs from Santa Ana. So here's our abacus bus stop. So you can see again, kind of from start to finish, how this idea was really fleshed out, right, through co-design. So you can see here our giant abacus, and we added some really nice signage up here in normally the advertisement spot of this bus shelter. And we just had these simple prompts for how families could use this, right? First, you want to set it up by pushing all of the beads to the left, and then you can either, count different things, make different numbers, or come up with your own game, right? So we wanted to offer a little bit of guidance, again, kind of creating that learning goal that you can put on top of these different activities to really help kiddos go and explore and have adults provide some of that guidance. We also were in the grocery store, as I mentioned earlier, and we had, again, a similar co-design process really was what created all of these final designs. But in the grocery store, we installed several different, prompts for how to talk about different science concepts while you're shopping at the grocery store. So this particular sign was placed in the produce section. And what it says here is, how do you pick the best fruit or vegetable? So kind of an open-ended prompt with an idea of how to maybe talk about those things by thinking about whether or not you're smelling it, you're using different senses, right? How are you determining what's the best one? And this was really something that parents told us that they thought would be really inspirational to put in the grocery store, because they said that when they used to shop for fruit and vegetables in their home countries, they would do a lot of different things, like touching it or smelling it to figure out if it was the best fruit or vegetable to pick. So this again highlights that intergenerational learning that was really coming through in our co-design sessions. Here is our How Tall Am I mural. And again, what you can see here is that this is something that was inspired by a caregiver, right? So she really wanted to see a ruler. Families also told us that they wanted to see animals, and so we embedded animals into this design. And you can see we have 2 ways of using it, right? The how tall am I and the how long am I. These animals were chosen by the community, and they all have embedded shapes in them as well, so that there's a variety of different ways to use this for different ages as well. On the right, this is one of our park installations. So this is Loteria. This is a game that families said was meaningful to them, that they played it at home. Here's our spinning wheel, right? So we were able to embed that idea again that families had for getting something that you can spin. They thought their kids would love that. But also we put that with a game that they said that they played with their kiddos at home. And we put it right into a park, right? So this is something that doesn't need a lot of instruction because it's something that families already connect to. And what you can see here are these different pieces. Essentially, Loteria is like, it's like bingo. So you spin the wheel, you get an icon, and then you can use that icon to spin one of these dials. And on the back of all of these are simple prompts that support some STEM learning goal, right? And then this was our another one of our park installations. This is a giant life-size board game called Parkopolis. And essentially what this really invites families to do is to roll these fraction dice and then to use themselves as pieces, right? And so you're moving across the board. There's tick marks in each one of these squares, and so you can move up a certain, fraction amount on the square. And then you obtain an icon on those squares, and that tells you which one of these tables to go to. And you flip through those books, and you're getting some type of fun and exciting, again, STEM-based prompt, right? So really trying to, again, make something that's very fun, that's very engaging and inviting, but also has that learning goal attached to it, but that was also co-created with families. So you can't see it in this video, but there are these signature squares on the corners of this game. And the game that we embedded into that, those set of signature squares is called Basta. And that was another game that families told us was really meaningful to them, something that they played with their kiddos. So we were, again, trying to take some of these different ideas and really embed them into things that can support learning in this playful environment. So I want to talk a little bit about the research side of things, because we are researchers who most of us were working on this project. So there was the research team and then our community partner. So we had a variety of research questions, right? We want to know what happens when we put these in community spaces. And so in this project, we had two primary research questions. The first was whether or not caregivers with access to playful learning landscapes would endorse more positive attitudes about informal STEM learning and STEM self-efficacy, and whether they would see greater connections between play and learning when compared to caregivers who didn't have access to these installations in their neighborhood. Our second question was whether or not families with direct access to these would exhibit more STEM conversations and more interactions compared to families who do not have those. And to answer these questions, we had two different methods. So to answer question one about caregivers' perspectives of the space, we used a site intercept survey. And that survey asked families to respond to a couple of, it was about 5-minute survey, so we tried to make it really quick. But we were asking them some simple questions about how frequently they go to the site, how safe they felt the site was, what type of impact they felt this site had on the community. We asked them about opportunities to learn different topics, right? So are there opportunities to learn math here? Are there opportunities to learn science here? Can you learn literacy here? We asked them about their views about play and whether or not you could play and learn together or at the same time. We asked them for some views on early science learning. And finally, we asked them about their own self-efficacy in helping their child learn different STEM-related topics, right? So science, math, and language. For our second research question about whether families are exhibiting more interaction and conversation in these spaces, we used naturalistic observation. And our observational tool was meant to capture what families were talking about in these spaces, right? So we were tallying the number of times that we heard families say things that were about whole number language, fraction language, spatial language, patterns, for instance. And we also coded for different indicators of interaction quality, including the number of back and forth conversations and the level of engagement and technology use. We collected data at 2 time points, right? Because we want to know if there is any change. So we went before we installed Playful Learning Landscapes to all of those places that you just saw, and we observed caregiver-child interactions in those spaces and asked families to respond to these site intercept surveys. And then we went back again and we did this after we installed Playful Learning Landscapes. So we were looking at these 2 time points to really see if there were any differences between the PLL sites pre and post. We also did all of the same data collection at matched control sites so that we could get a sense for whether or not the increases that we were seeing at the PLL sites was unique to those sites, or was it was there more of this happening across the community for whatever reason, right? So the matched control sites really serve an important function here for our research questions. And they were, I will say the matched control sites were in a adjacent neighborhood, right? That was matched on a variety of different demographic characteristics. We still have just a little bit more data that we're collecting, but I will be able to share just our overall what we're seeing thus far. And I will tell you that what we have collected thus far are 254 site intercept surveys pre-PLL, 248 surveys post-PLL, and these are evenly distributed across those different sites, right? So parks, bus stops, and grocery stores. And for our naturalistic observations, we have 192 pre-PLL and 278 post-PLL. And I will say that our target sample size across both of these types of data collection methods was that we wanted to collect approximately 25 intercept surveys and observations pre-PLL at each one of these sites and approximately 50 post-PLL. And so you can see the surveys were a little higher, and that's actually because our caregivers that we worked with to co-design were invited to also be data ambassadors in this project. And so they were collecting our site intercept surveys, and they were very successful at getting people to answer the questions. They were so successful that we far exceeded what we thought we could capture with the surveys, which is also, I'm not talking about it much here, but it is another benefit of working with communities and inviting communities to be part of every stage of the process, is that they were gaining a lot of really important skills and research that they wanted. And they were also able to advocate for these in their community and to collect data. So it was a really a nice way, I think, of showing how communities can be involved in all of these stages. Okay, so I'm going to not show you a lot of statistics or figures because I didn't want to overload anyone, but I'm going to give you just kind of the snapshot of what we found, and I'm happy to direct you to some of our papers or to, I can share other slides with you if you want to have more of those specific details. But what we saw in terms of research question 1, so those site intercept surveys, is that post Playful Learning Landscapes, caregivers reported more positive views about the impact of those sites on their community. So that's a really great finding. They felt that this bus stop, for instance, with an abacus, after it was there, they feel that this particular bus shelter is now having a higher impact in their community, which is great. They also described having more positive beliefs about the connection between play and learning. And there was greater self-efficacy and stronger beliefs about the value of early science learning. So several of these were actually consistent across the matched control sites as well. So that's a question that we have to sort of wrestle with. Why were we seeing some of these strengthen, not just at our PLL sites, but also at our matched control sites? And so that's something that we're still talking about. But I will say that the PLL sites uniquely impacted perceptions of safety and opportunities to learn. So that was not the case at the matched control sites. The PLL sites really were again, strengthening caregivers' views of safety. And they felt that those sites had a lot more opportunities to learn different topics, which is great because that's really what PLLs are also sort of in the community to help support, is that strengthening those perceptions about the fact that you can learn science and math in all of these different spaces by simply tweaking them. Okay, so for our observations, for families with low engagement, so when we observed, right, some families were documented to be not very engaged with the activities. And this was the case both pre and post PLL. Some families just did not interact with those installations. There was, as you would imagine, very little evidence of an impact of PLL on language and interaction quality, right? So if they're not interacting to begin with, even if PLL is there, we're not really seeing any differences in how much they're conversing or what type of interaction they're having. But for families who were engaged, what we saw was more whole number talk at the abacus bus stop, which is great because that's really what that tool is affording a conversation about. We saw more overall STEM talk at the PLL parks. So when we say STEM talk as a whole, we're thinking of things like spatial language, fractions, patterns, making observations, asking questions. We saw a lot of that. We also saw that children in particular were very engaged. So parents were great at telling us really like, this is what my kiddo will love in a community space, and kiddos really did love it. But parents were not necessarily like following their kids into that activity, right? And so that's another question that we have moving forward, and a consideration that we're thinking about is how can we really bring parents into this experience as well? Because clearly the kiddos love it, but parents sometimes are like, okay, great, my kid has something to do now, I can, chill out, which is totally I totally understand that, right? And so we're just thinking about ways to create these so that, again, parents are really feeling that they can be involved in that interaction too. Okay. I'm going to try to run through this one a little bit faster, but I want to give you an example of playful learning in early childcare education. And what I really want to highlight here is the fact that we can use our model, that three-part model that I started with, to apply this type of co-design and playful learning experience, not just to public spaces, but also to these different settings, right? So early education is one of those settings where we said, can we go here and can we create something with educators, co-design with educators to create this type of experience? And this was a project, again, with a variety of folks. We were working with Bright Horizons in Philadelphia, and we had 6 centers that we were working with. Very similar co-design process that I described in the Santa Ana, California project. We had a more constrained time frame here. So we had to do this project in about 2.5 years, whereas the Santa Ana project ended up being about 6 years. So you're going to see everything sort of like the same, but a little bit shorter, right? So when we co-designed in California, we had several years to do that. Here we didn't have as much time. So we hosted 4 co-design workshops over Zoom with educators. We did, across our 6 centers, have 40 teachers, center directors, and parents who were affiliated participate. So there was a lot of interest, again, in creating these playful learning experiences for their centers. And we, again, used a lot of activities that were fun, that really were meant to identify core practices and values, to identify key learning goals that were important to embed into those designs, and just a variety of different design ideas from those who were helping with this process. We used, again, a Mad Libs activity that I just described to uncover some of those valuable practices. And educators primarily told us that they wanted to support children's curiosity and investigation. They wanted to really foster diversity and inclusion. So these were things that we kept in mind as we moved forward with the designs. Educators also gave us some really valuable information about where they thought these would be best placed in their centers. So some of the educators told us the playground is a space where we want to see more of these types of opportunities, right? So maybe we can move beyond free play on the playground and more into this guided play experience. They told us about different indoor play places that they felt were a little bit, that could be spruced up, right, with this type of activity. And they also mentioned hallways, right? So hallways were something that they said, well, there's nothing really here. So could we put something here that really promotes some of that language and conversation and play in a space that really we just have kind of overlooked in our centers. We also, in some of our co-design sessions and those workshops with educators, we used different tools to ask them what they felt were important learning goals. And so these were educators really putting these types of sticky notes, right, on this whiteboard to tell us what they thought would be really important to embed into these designs. And we heard a lot of different design ideas from them, a story wheel, scenes from their neighborhood, the Philadelphia skyline. They wanted to, highlight numbers or patterns, and they thought a mural would be a really nice type of design to implement for their kiddos. So what I'll show you next are the designs that we put into these early child care centers. We had 2 types of designs that targeted literacy learning, and then 2 that targeted STEM learning. Our literacy PLLs, and you'll see that these are reflective of what they were telling us was important to them. We have a mural. This is a scene from the neighborhood. This includes a lot of imagery that educators told us they wanted to see in them. We have the skyline. We have a variety of symbols that really reflect Philadelphia. And we had, for instance, just kiddos and families and different types of experiences happening here. So there's a lot going on. And we have these really simple prompts here on the right side. So can you find words that rhyme? Can you find words that start with the same letter? Can you tell a story? So again, really trying to prompt some of those conversations through an experience with a mural like this. And then our second literacy design is our story wheel. And so what this story wheel is meant to do is to have kiddos collect components of a story. So we have character, setting, conflict, and solution. And then they would stand on this little stage that says, tell your story, and they could tell a story, right? And so different ways of interacting with this, you could have different kiddos collecting different components and then working together to generate that story. instance. We also had 2 STEM PLLs. We, again, did the same type of mural design, but instead of having prompts about literacy on the right side, we replaced those with prompts about shape identification and pattern recognition. So you can see those there. And again, you can see this was in a center that was located in Center City of Philadelphia. And so you can see the scene is a little less neighborhood, like it looks more like Center City, right? Because this is the environment that those kiddos are in. And then we had what we called our dancing game. And this was a design that was inspired by the popular DDR game that you might have seen at the arcade. And so the goal here was to have kiddos working together to complete patterns and to identify different shapes or icons, right? So on the other side of this panel, of this structure here, there's a panel. So like you can imagine one kid standing on this side and another kid on the other side. And on the other side, there's sort of this sequence of patterns that the kiddo can read to their peer, and they're kind of working together to solve that problem. Okay, so we also have research questions here. We wanted to know whether or not playful learning landscapes in early childcare impacted teacher-child interactions and conversations. And we were also interested in whether or not it impacted children's learning, right? Could we see any benefit of interacting with PLL in their centers on how kids were developing certain math and literacy skills? So in this study, we had 6, as I mentioned, 6 participating early childcare centers, and we randomly assigned them to either get the STEM playful learning landscapes or the literacy playful learning landscapes. So 3 got STEM, 3 got literacy. And then what we did was we assessed all of these centers across these same methods, right? So we had for our first question, I think I messed this up, sorry. I'm going to go over this. For our first question, we had the naturalistic observations, right? So this looks very similar to the tool we use in California. We just added literacy learning to that. So again, when we go into these spaces in the center, we are documenting what teachers and kiddos are talking about. And we're tallying up the number of times that they're using STEM-based language, literacy-based language, and we're looking at conversational turns, engagement, communication style, those types of things. And then we were also in a unique position for this particular project to actually individually assess kiddos, right? So we asked kiddos before and after we brought these playful learning installations to their centers to complete 4 different activities: a shape identification task, a pattern completion task, a storytelling task, and an expressive vocabulary task. And so we were asking them to tell us again, what's the name of the shape for the shape identification, to complete patterns for us, to just tell us a story. We let them just tell us a story. And something that we were interested in, right, is whether or not after exposure or experience with playful learning landscapes, do they identify more shapes? Do they complete more patterns? Do they tell a more complex story? And can they define some of these vocabulary terms with a fuller definition? Again, we collected data at 2 time points, pre and post playful learning landscapes. And I'll say that for our individual assessments, we had 47 children across the 6 centers who were assessed at pre and post. There was a larger sample that was collected pre, but there were a variety of kiddos that either aged out or left the center. And so we were left with 47 who had who participated across that whole study time period. And we also collected 303 5-minute observations, and these 303 observations were evenly distributed between pre and post PLL and across those 6 centers. And the paper for this is published, so if you want to see more about the data that we collected and are more than I can articulate in a talk today, you can definitely feel free to read this paper, and if you want me to send it to you, I'm happy to do this. Okay, so again, to just tell you what we found with respect to our first question about whether or not playful learning in ECE impacted teacher-child interactions and conversations. What we found was that educators and children used more STEM language when interacting with STEM playful learning landscapes and more literacy language when interacting with literacy playful learning landscapes. So that's really interesting because, again, it supports that not only that these types of experiences support conversations, but it also highlights that these installations can have an embedded learning goal on a different type of topic or content area, and that actually sparks more of the conversation about those topics, right? So, so you can design with those kind of topics or content areas in mind, and you can really kind of guide that conversation around those topics. So this is kind of a double, you know, it's a good thing to see that it's promoting conversations and also that it's the designs were really affording a certain type of conversation. We also found in our observations that educators and children displayed high levels of engagement with playful learning landscapes in their centers, and that educators were more involved in children's play with playful learning landscapes compared to children's free play on the playground, right? So when we made these observations, we were looking at playground experiences pre, and then we were looking at wherever these PLLs were installed in their center post. And all of the pre-installation observations were on playgrounds, right? So you're kind of getting a sense for like a free play sort of situation compared to the PLL. And adults were, in this particular study, the adults teachers were more involved in the play experience, right? So again, we're kind of getting at that, can we have adult initiated play with child directedness, right? We didn't see any impact of playful learning on the number of back and forth conversations, and we are not entirely sure why that's the case, but we definitely felt that maybe there was just more kiddos in the observations on the playground, which could have sparked a little bit more talk amongst the kiddos as they were running around in groups together, whereas these PLLs were kind of best used by a couple of kids, and I think that educators were really trying to contain kiddos so that there was kind of like a turn taking sort of situation going on. So they were like, okay, 2 kiddos can use this installation at a time. And it kind of lowered the number of kiddos in that observation and it decreased the number of conversational turns. For the individual assessments, and so as I mentioned, we asked kiddos to complete some of those assessments pre and post. What we found overall was that age was the best predictor of growth in those math and literacy skills. And so this isn't quite surprising. This was a pretty high bar to reach in terms of seeing particular growth for those kids. But our exploratory analyses did find that children who interacted with a literacy PLL in their center offered fuller definitions of the term character. So at least on one of the tasks that we were implementing with them, there was some evidence of a unique learning goal or skill that was coming out of perhaps that interaction with playful learning in their centers. But really this was a little bit limited in terms of we only asked kiddos to complete these assessments after 2 months with PLL in their centers. So it would be really nice if we had more time and money in this study to go again, let's say 6 months later, right, to see if those more time or dosage, right, with PLL might have actually strengthened some of those learning outcomes. And so that's a really nice question for future work. Okay, so I will just close with a brief discussion and a summary of what we found. So in public spaces, right, in California, we found that playful learning landscapes positively impacted perceptions of the space. It's really helped caregivers feel safer there, and they felt that there were more opportunities to learn STEM concepts there. We also saw that increased talk about STEM topics at the Atticus bus stop and at parks. And these were those installations that I described earlier, so Parkopolis, Hapalama, Loteria. And we found that it impacted children's engagement, which was highlighting the benefits of designing these public spaces to be child-friendly, which I think in and of itself is a really important goal for us, right? A lot of cities are not designed with kiddos in mind. And so if we can design them with kiddos in mind and make them child-friendly spaces, I think that's really one thing that we can achieve with playful learning landscapes. And then we'll think more carefully about how to bring caregivers into that interaction in future projects. In our project with early childcare, what we really found here was that playful learning landscapes positively impacted the language environment. So as I mentioned, there was more STEM talk for centers with STEM PLLs, more literacy talk for centers with literacy PLLs, which is really exciting finding. We also found that there was more educator involvement in play, which is also consistent with creating those guided play or playful learning experiences. And we saw some minimal impact of learning for children who received literacy PLL. So again, some evidence to support that PLL is having some impact on the learning skills of kiddos. So I have a variety of future considerations that I think are important here. So one thing that we've been thinking about for our public spaces projects is that site activation is maybe one way to increase caregiver engagement. And we have started this in Philadelphia with a program called Play Ambassadors. So there are several PLLs in Philadelphia, and Play Ambassadors basically recruits youth from the community and asks them to be kind of these ambassadors, right? Can they go to these spaces and can they invite families into that experience and sort of guide them to it and say, here's this really cool opportunity that is here in your community. You might not have known about it or what it was even here for, and sort of kind of advertising that as in a sense, right? Kind of letting families know that it exists and offering some support about how to use it if there is any confusion about what to do with that particular installation. And so there's some evidence that that's been successful in Philadelphia, and it might be in future projects as well. Site selection is also a really important consideration. And we still see this play out a lot in California, where we were really trying to manage the community desires and the city restrictions, right? And so some of the observations that we had there weren't revealing a lot of engagement by families, even with playful learning landscapes in that space. And some of the reasons we thought that might be the case is because, for instance, the parks that we implemented PLL in one of the parks was a park that caregivers told us was not a park they wanted to really see these because they felt that park was really unsafe. And when we went to the city and we said, can we do a different park? They were like, no, that's the only park. And so there are some of these kind of like roadblocks that you'll hit along the way. And so we went forward with it because we thought, well, let's see what happens if we put it there. Maybe there will be a reduction in some of the activity that's here that is causing families to think this is unsafe. And since we just implemented those, it's really still to be seen if that is the case. And overall, we did see parents suggesting that it was feeling safer. So I think that these are things that we're thinking about. It's pretty complex when you're working in these types of community settings to really manage a lot of different, just issues and challenges that might come up. And finally, I really think that it's important moving forward to have ideas about new methodological approaches that can explore how playful learning landscapes impacts the language environment. You'll notice that I talked a lot about 6C skill, but we have yet really to measure 6C skills as an outcome because we've been looking at conversations and interactions. So moving forward, developing a tool to really get at those learning goals and the 6C skills would be a valuable addition to this. And also seeing how an experience with playful learning landscapes transfers to other settings or other home-based learning experiences, right? So if we are having an impact on parent self-efficacy, right, or parent perceptions about the value of play and learning at a PLL, you can imagine that consistent dosage might actually transfer some of that into other experiences that families are having in their daily lives. Okay, so I think with that, we have about 5 minutes and I'm happy to answer questions.
You see any particular improvements or not for children with disabilities in particular?
That's a good question. We weren't looking at that, so we weren't really coding for any of that in these studies. But I think it's a really important area that people are interested in moving to, is trying to figure out how can we design these with like these different lenses, right? And so we have not worked with folks that are in those different populations, and so I think that's still something we're looking towards, but yeah, that's a good question.
For the literacy settings, do you do like English and Spanish, or does that depend on the area? Like bilingual?
Yeah, good question. So in the literacy PLLs in early childcare, so those centers, their primary language is English, and so all of those installations were in English as well. But for instance, in California, that community was a Spanish-speaking community, and so everything that we put there was in both English and Spanish. So we also turn to communities too as important, people with expertise about like what language do we have to put these in, or should we put these in to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible. And for the early childcare settings, they told us that English was fine to keep it to that. Yeah. So we didn't have it there, but certainly if we were to apply that to a different place where Spanish or any other language was part of a design consideration, then we would have designed with it. Yeah.
Do you have any plans moving forward for this area? Are you going to be doing anything?
Yeah. So as you can imagine, this takes a lot of time and effort to establish a partnership and get stuff up and going. And so right now we are working with MetroCare, which is a clinical provider in the area. And we are starting to think about how we can design some of their waiting room spaces to really encourage some of these playful learning interactions. And I think that that's a really interesting spot to target, because families often spend a lot of time in waiting rooms, and there's sometimes not a ton to do, right? So there might be some books or some like sensory, stuff on the walls. But there isn't really like that again, playful learning is really taking some of that like free play stuff and like enhancing it, right? Kind of like, okay, can we take these concepts and can we make them a little bit more like culturally meaningful and also have a learning goal attached? And so we're going to be going into the clinic waiting areas and actually trying to get a sense from folks who are in that space what they would like to see there, and then using a similar sort of co-design process where we can take some of those ideas and embed them with the science of how children learn and what children need to learn, and then put those there. And then since MetroCare has a variety of clinics in the area, we're also positioned to do some of those pre and post observations and data collection methods, where we can look at like what happens at this location if we put PLL here, and what happens in a location if we didn't put PLL, right? So we can give some comparison of that. And then I know that the library has been really interested in implementing this here in Dallas. And so I think, again, that's a really great place to go. We've done it before, and we could do it, I think, again, with more community involvement to see what impact that might have on conversations. Yes, in the back. Yeah.
Would you ever look at the lens of like more like that public health standpoint, since you are in like a medical facility? Because I know there's some studies out there of those designs being a grocery store encouraging talk regarding fruits and vegetables. So that possible.
Yeah, I think if you're asking kind of about like learning goals or like the topics that we're talking about, I think that certainly these are really like there's not a ton that goes into that model, right? So it can be really designed in a way that meets the needs of like the community and what all of the people at the table want to see. So I think if there is, for instance, we wrote a grant last year to really try to create some designs that supported talk about climate literacy. And that was kind of, I think, something like you're getting at, where we were thinking like, okay, can we create something with communities that also highlights a learning goal that is, you're working with groups that wanted to support that learning goal. So we were thinking about creative ways to really bring that type of talk to the surface, essentially. So I think that, yes, there's definitely different, and we've had like reading campaigns, right? Where like some funders of work in Philadelphia said, we want to support reading this summer. So how can we design something that really fosters that particular learning goal? And so we've embedded those types of ideas into the designs that we've implemented in other projects. Yeah.
Are you deciding like where you're putting the PLLs, and are you gonna put them in other states? Like, just how do you decide that? Sorry.
Yeah, good question. In terms of like if we're thinking specific, like when we work with a community, we will typically ask them where they think would be best to put these. So in California, obviously, we said we feel like this, a grocery store, a park, and a bus stop would be really useful places, since we've seen that in other projects, and they confirmed, the caregivers confirmed that those are spaces they were doing as well. But in terms of thinking about other places, I mean, this is just these are two quick examples of where we put these, but they have appeared in other spaces like laundromats, grocery stores, not just in Philadelphia, but also in Chicago and in Pittsburgh. This movement is really exploded across kind of the US. And so these types of playful learning experiences are in a lot of different states and a lot of different cities, and they're just designed according to essentially creating some of those partnerships with a nonprofit who says, you know, this is something that we really want to see in our community, and then we work with the community to say, okay, do you want to see this in your community? And typically they do, and so then we start to work together to figure out how we can implement that in a way that's again meaningful to them and that is in a space where they are frequenting often.
This kind of similar question, but it's more when deciding on what location to choose, you have limits, as you mentioned before, right? So is there a correlation with what socioeconomic level neighborhoods get most access to it? Or is it like more or less evenly distributed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will say that all of the PLLs that we've implemented thus far have been in lower resource communities. And so we typically go to those communities and we say, where can we find like a liaison or some type of nonprofit organization that we can work with or collaborate with to really make that space, to highlight the space in that specific community. So I will say that the California project is probably the only, it was kind of the largest scale project we've done. And it was the one where we hit the most red tape, I think, in terms of like where we could be in those community spaces. But in Philadelphia, I think there are, I think, don't quote me, but I think there are over 100 PLLs in Philadelphia now. There are a lot of them there. And there's like a lot of city buy-in at this point. And so it becomes less of an issue about where to, like how to implement it there, because there's even like a playful learning fellow who sits in the city's like on the city education department, right? And so there's a lot of buy-in. And I think that's one of the things that we have seen is really helpful, is that if you have somebody who is supporting your goals from these different levels, then you can really move those goals forward. Whereas in California, we were kind of like, all right, we got this grant, we have this partnership, let's go. And then as we started moving forward, we were like, oh wait, we need to ask the government, we need to ask the city. And then we're starting to ask these people, and they're like, you're doing what, where? And so once they realized what we were doing, they became very, they became advocates of this work too, right? And so I think in moving forward, there's still more happening in California, and now there's less red tape to hit because they have now seen what we're doing. And so I think it's always, we're kind of always learning through this, because oftentimes researchers don't work with communities, or not communities, city governments, right? And so when we're going into the gut, we're like, okay, I've never done this before, but now I have to pour concrete in like a park. So how do I do that, right? And so we're just kind of all how to go navigate all of this. And as we have gone through several iterations of these projects at this point, I think we've now kind of got in our toolkit, like, okay, we need to ask all of these questions up front to make sure that this is going to be achieved in a way that is the most beneficial. Yeah.
So are you familiar by any chance with Too Small to Fail or other entities like that?
Yeah.
And do you guys then kind of, and this goes back a couple of questions where you talked about, you know, partnering with other groups. Do you regularly collaborate or kind of cross-pollinate for these different entities to then implement this on a larger scale?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I didn't mention it here, but there is a nonprofit called Playful Learning Landscapes. And that nonprofit is sort of our, this initiative's like steering arm, so to speak, right? And so they are not part of a university, but they sit kind of on their own, and they have lots of partnerships with Too Small to Fail, with Kaboom, which is in Philadelphia, with a variety of different programs like that, right? And so they work together very closely to see these types of projects in a variety of different spaces that even if there's no university involved, those things are happening and they're being implemented. And then from the university side of things, a lot of times what we're doing is we're either consulting with Playful Learning Landscapes to provide a lens for how to research or evaluate the impact. And then also we are going out into community spaces and doing some of that too. But typically some of those other programs, initiatives are part of like the consultant group that will help, you know.
So it's like real world implementation, but then you guys get the opportunity to do some of the backup research.
Yes.
And continue to learn.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm interested in like designing something for children, like either digitally or like physical, like space or like anything. Like what would be like how would I be able to get involved in that field, or like do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think that like we've always just had conversations with different folks who are interested in getting involved, and then we try to find the shared sort of like where can we all work together to achieve a similar goal. I will say that a lot of times, like something that we will run into, at least as researchers, is that we have to find some like funding essentially to support these projects. But once we have everyone at the table, we can usually say, okay, we have this really good idea. We have all of these different and unique perspectives and people with these different expertise at the table. And then we can move forward and see how we can support the shared goal of supporting learning in a space with these folks in mind. But we do have, I will say, so Playful Learning Landscapes, the nonprofit, they have separately developed a variety of different technical assistance programs that if you were an individual and you wanted to move through their network, you could reach out to them, and then they offer a variety of different supports and services to individuals or to organizations that are interested in this. And they can help, sort of direct folks to, again, those networks that would be really fruitful for collaboration.
All right. Thank you so much for